Armed forces are always properly equipped and resourced. That is why we now conduct a regular strategic defence and security review to ensure the resources we have meet the ambitions of the national security strategy. We're meeting our NATO commitment to spend 2% of our GDP on defence and planning to invest at least £178 billion on new military equipment over the next decade. We've also enshrined the Armed Forces Covenant in law to ensure that our armed forces and their families receive the treatment and the respect they deserve. Mr. Speaker, sending our brave troops onto the battlefield without the right equipment was unacceptable, and whatever else we learn from this conflict, we must all pledge this will never happen again. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, there will be further lessons to learn from studying this report, and I commit today that that is exactly what we'll do. But, Mr. Speaker, in reflecting on this report and my own experience, there are also some lessons here that I do not think we should draw. First, it would be wrong to conclude that we shouldn't stand with our American allies when our common security interests are threatened. Yeah. We must never be afraid to speak frankly and honestly, as best friends always should, and where we commit our troops together, there must be a structure through which our views can be properly conveyed and differences worked through. But it remains the case that Britain and America share the same fundamental values, and Britain has no greater friend or ally in the world than America, and that our partnership remains as important for our security and prosperity today as it has ever been. Yeah. Second, I think it would be wrong to conclude that we cannot rely on the judgments of our brilliant and hard-working intelligence agencies. We know the debt we owe them in helping to keep us safe every day of the year. Since November 2014, they've enabled us to foil 7 different planned terrorist attacks on the streets of the United Kingdom. What this report shows is there needs to be a proper separation between the process of assessing intelligence and the policy making that flows from it. And as a result of the reform since the Butler report, that is what we now have in place. Third, it would be completely wrong to conclude that our military are not capable of intervening successfully around the world. Many of the failures in this report were not directly about the conduct of armed forces as they went into Iraq, but rather the failures of planning before a shot was fired. There's no question that Britain's armed forces remain the envy of the world, and the decisions we've taken to ensure they're properly resourced will ensure they stay that way. Finally, we should not conclude that intervention is always wrong. There are unquestionably times when it is right to intervene, as this country did successfully in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. And I'm sure that many in this House would agree that there have been times in the recent past when we should have intervened but didn't, like in failing to prevent the genocides in Rwanda or Srebrenica. Intervention is hard. War fighting is not always the most difficult part. Often the state building that follows is a much more complex challenge. We should not be naive to think that just because we have the best prepared plans in the real world, things can't go wrong. And equally, just because intervention is difficult, it doesn't mean that there are not times when it is right and necessary. Yes, Britain has and will continue to learn the lessons of this report, but as with our intervention against Daesh in Iraq and Syria today, Britain must not and will not shrink from its role on the world stage or fail to protect its people. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before addressing the issues raised in the Iraq Inquiry report, I would like to remember and honour the 179 British servicemen and women who were killed and the thousands maimed and injured during the Iraq War and their families, as well as the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who have died as a result of the invasion and occupation launched by the US and British governments 13 years ago. Yesterday, I had a private meeting with some of the families of the British dead, as I've continued to do over the past dozen years. It's always a humbling experience to witness the resolve and resilience of those families and their unwavering commitment to seek truth and justice for those that they lost in Iraq. They have waited 7 years for Sir John Chilcot's report. It was right that the inquiry heard evidence from such a wide range of people and that the origins, conduct and aftermath of the war should have been examined in such detail. But the extraordinary length of time it has taken to see the light of day is, frankly, clearly a matter for regret. I should add that the scale of the report, running to 6,275 pages, to which I was only given access at 8 o'clock this morning, means that today's response by all of us can only be a provisional one. Mr. Speaker, the decision to invade and occupy Iraq in March 2003 was the most significant foreign policy decision taken by a British government in modern times. It divided this House and set the government of the day against a majority of the British people, as well as against the weight of global opinion. The war was not in any way, as Sir John Chilcot says, a last resort. Frankly, it was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, as the inquiry accepts, and has long been regarded as illegal by the overwhelming weight of international legal opinion. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the displacement of millions of refugees. It devastated Iraq's infrastructure and society. The occupation fostered a lethal sectarianism, as the report indicates, that turned into a civil war. Instead of protecting security at home or abroad, the war fueled and spread terrorism across the region. To the Sunday's suicide bomb attack in Baghdad, which killed over 250 people, the deadliest so far, was carried out by a group whose origins lie in the aftermath of the invasion. By any measure, the invasion and occupation of Iraq has been, for many, a catastrophe. Mr. Speaker, the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 on the basis of what the Chilcot report calls, and I quote, flawed intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction, has had a far-reaching impact on us all. It's led to a fundamental breakdown in trust in politics and in our institutions of government. The tragedy is that while the governing class got it so horrifically wrong, many of our people actually got it right. Many, on February the 15th, 2003, 1.5 million, spanning the entire political spectrum, and tens and millions of other people across the world, marched against the impending war, the biggest ever demonstration in British history. It wasn't, Mr. Speaker, that those of us who opposed the war, underestimated the brutality or the crimes of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. Indeed, many of us campaigned against the Iraqi regime during its most bloody period, when the British government and the US administration were actually supporting that regime, as was confirmed by the 1996 Scott inquiry. But we could see this state, broken by sanctions and war, posed no military threat, and the WMD evidence was flimsy and confected, that going to war without United Nations authorization was profoundly dangerous, that foreign invasion and occupation would be resisted by force, and they would set off a series of uncontrollable and destructive events. If only this House had been able to listen to the wisdom of many of our own people when it voted on the 18th of March against waiting for a UN authorization for a second resolution, the course of events might have been different. All but 16 of the members of the official opposition at that time supported the war, whilst many in my party voted against it, as did others in other opposition parties. There are members here today on all benches, including dozens of my Labour colleagues, who voted against the war. But none of us, Mr. Speaker, should take any satisfaction from this report. Instead, all of us, I believe...
We can't have a running commentary on the statements made from the front bench. Members of this House know me well enough to know that I will allow all opinions to be expressed, and if that means the Prime Minister has to be here for quite a long time, he's accustomed to that. But the right honourable gentleman is entitled to be heard with courtesy. If people want to witter away, leave the chamber. It's boring and we don't need you. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have to be saddened at what has been revealed, and we must now reflect on that. In addition to all those British service people and Iraqi civilians and combatants who lost their lives in the conflict, there are many members here who voted to stop the war, but have not lived to see themselves vindicated by this report. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, it would do us well to remember Robin Cook, who stood over there 13 years ago and said in a few hundred words, in advance of the tragedy to come, what has been confirmed by this report in more than 2 million words. The Chilcot report has rightly dug deep into the litany of failures of planning for the occupation, the calamitous decision to stand down the Iraqi army and to dissolve the entire Iraqi state as a process of de-Baathification. But the reality is, it was the original decision to follow the US president into this war, in the most volatile region in the world, and impose a colonial-style occupation that led to every other disaster. The government's September 2002 dossier, with its claim declaring that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed in 45 minutes, was only the most notorious of many deceptions. As Major General Michael Lorry told the inquiry, and I quote, "We knew at the time that the purpose of the dossier was precisely to make the case for war rather than setting out the available intelligence." Military action in Iraq not only turned a humanitarian crisis into a disaster, it also convulsed the entire region, just as intervention in Libya in 2011 has sadly left the country in the grip of warring militias and terror groups. And the Iraq War actually increased the threat of terrorism around the country, as Baroness Manningham-Buller, former head of MI5, made clear to the inquiry. There are many lessons that need to be drawn from the Iraq War and the investigation carried out by Sir John Chilcot and his inquiry for our government, our country, this Parliament, as well as my party and indeed every other party. They include the need for a more open and independent relationship with the United States and for a foreign policy based on upholding international law and the authority of the United Nations, which always seeks peaceful solutions to international disputes. We also need, and the Prime Minister indicated this, much stronger oversight of the security and intelligence services, full restoration of proper cabinet government, and give Parliament the decisive say over any future decisions to go to war, based on objective information, not just through government discretion, but through a War Powers Act that I hope this Parliament will pass. And as in the wake of Iraq, our own and other Western governments increasingly resort to hybrid warfare based on the use of drones and special forces, our democracy, and our democracy is crucial and important, needs to ensure that their use is subject to proper parliamentary scrutiny. There are no more important decisions a Member of Parliament ever gets asked to make than those relating to peace and war. The very least that Members of Parliament and the country should be able to expect is rigorous and objective evidence on which to base their crucial decisions. We now know that the House was misled in the run-up to the war, and the House must now decide how it should deal with it 13 years later, just as all those who took the decisions laid bare in the Chilcot report must face up to the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be. Later today, I'll be meeting a group of families of military servicemen and women who lost loved ones, Iraq War veterans and Iraqi citizens who have lost family members as a result of the war that the US and British governments launched in 2003. I'll be discussing with them, our public and the Iraqi people, the decisions taken by our then government that led the country into war with the terrible consequences. Quite bluntly, Mr. Speaker, there are huge lessons for every single one of us here today. We make decisions that have consequences that don't just go on for the immediate years, they go on for decades and decades afterwards. We need to reflect very seriously before we take any decisions, again, to take military action without realising the consequences of those will live with all of us for many decades to come and have often incalculable consequences as a result.
Prime Minister.
Well, let me briefly respond to that, because I want to leave as much time for colleagues to make their points. I think the right honourable gentleman is right to praise the families for the dignity they've shown. I understand the regret over the time taken, and I think we all feel that. The only point I'd make is when you have an independent report, you have to allow it to be independent, and you have to allow the chairman to make his own or her own decisions in their own way. And so while it's been frustrating, I think that frustration has probably been better than intervention. In terms of the time he was given to read the report, I didn't want politicians, including the former Prime Minister, to be given more time than the families themselves, and that's why the 8 o'clock deadline was set. On the report itself, look, I think he's right to say that the report finds that the intervention did create space for Al-Qaeda. The only point I'd make is it is important to remember that violent Islamist extremism, Al-Qaeda and all of that, started long before the Iraq War, started with, in fact, long before 9/11 itself, which of course was several years before the Iraq invasion. I think it's important for us to remember that. In terms of the litany of failures, I'd urge him to read, I've been able to read the executive summary and some other bits and pieces, and I'm sure colleagues will. He's right, there are a litany of failures: the disbanding of the army, the de-Baathification, the way the Kurdish and Provisional Authority worked, the failure to plan for the aftermath, and I think the very, very powerful points made by Sir John Chilcot. In terms of the lessons to learn, I thought many of the points he made I think we have already put in place proper cabinet discussions, National Security Council discussions, parliamentary votes, the oversight of the intelligence agencies. I would urge him, before coming up with even more ways to oversee our intelligence agencies, I would really urge colleagues from right around the House to look at the way the beefed up Intelligence and Security Committee works and the other things that we've done, not least in the legislation going through both houses. We do need to leave, I think, our intelligence services with a clear set of instructions and oversight arrangements rather than change them every 5 minutes. War Powers Act. I think this is something that will be discussed in the two-day debate. It's something I have looked at very carefully, and I've come to the conclusion this is not the right thing to do. I think we'll get ourselves into a legal mess, but I think the House should clearly debate it, as it will when it considers this report. And on the issue of the United States, he calls for an open and something partnership. Look, I don't believe the United States is always right about everything, but I do believe our partnership with the United States is vital for our national security, and I rather fear his approaches the United States is always wrong. I don't think they're always right, but I think they're always our best partner, and we should work with them. But I'd urge him and others to take the time to read the report in its not in its entirety. I don't think any of us will have time for 3.8 million words, but it's very carefully judged and very carefully thought through, and I think you should read it in conjunction with the statement that Sir John has given today, which is a very articulate distillation of what he says in his 200-page summary, and I think that's what we should be guided by.
Yeah. Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, we'll all need time to study the many damning conclusions in this report about how this catastrophic decision was reached in 2003. But the Prime Minister does say we should read it with an eye to future lessons for the machinery of government. Does my right honourable friend agree that, whilst I know from my own experience that the introduction of the National Security Council was a very valuable innovation, that his successor should be recommended to look at whether or not we should not return to the pre-Blair era of full collective cabinet responsibility with proper time for meetings, proper information and studied conclusions, and whether we should not also look at whether parliamentary accountability for these things should be reconsidered so that there are full and properly informed debates here, held in good time before, in this case, the military are deployed and everything is set in hand and the position is irreversible. We really do need to go back to a much more collective and accountable form of government.
Well, my honourable friend makes good points. Let me respond. In terms of cabinet responsibility, yes, before a decision like this is made, you need to have a cabinet meeting and cabinet discussion. But I would not try and substitute that for what the work the NSC now does, because, frankly, having sitting in front of you around the table the head of MI5, the head of MI6, the head of the chief of the defence staff, they are sitting there as equal members, able to speak up and tell you what they think. That debate, I think, is frankly more valuable than simply listening to other secretaries of state, although they are also there as well. So I still think that is the best place to do that. In terms of parliamentary debates, yes, we should have them, and it is good if you have them in reasonable time. I think one of the issues with the Iraq debate is it was so close to the point of decision that I think many colleagues felt that to vote in a different way was somehow to let down our troops on the eve of a vitally important decision. So early debate is always good.
Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Prime Minister for advance sight of the statement and a few short hours this morning to have a look at the millions of words in the report. Today we remember the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Iraq, Iraqi civilians, and of course the 179 UK service personnel who have lost their lives. Today is an important, it's a sombre day for their families, and our hearts go out to them. The report that we are considering now will be pored over in the days, the weeks, the months ahead, and it should be the first step in learning the lessons from the UK's most shameful foreign policy action in decades. At paragraph 416 of the Executive Summary, the Chilcot report confirms that on the 28th of July 2002, Tony Blair wrote to President Bush saying, and I quote, "I will be with you, whatever." Frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is remarkable that the Prime Minister didn't think that that was even noteworthy to mention in his statement to the House. And my first question to the Prime Minister is why? Given much of the debate rests about the rationale of the Prime Minister of the time signing up to whatever course of action the United States was prepared to pursue. On intelligence, the report concludes, paragraph 807, that the assessed intelligence had not established beyond doubt either that Saddam Hussein had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons or that efforts to develop nuclear weapons continued. I completely understand, Mr. Speaker, why the families of dead and injured UK service personnel and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis will feel that they were deceived about the reasons for going to war in Iraq. I completely understand why they also feel let down when it came to the post-conflict situation. And the Chilcot report catalogues in graphic detail the failures in planning for post-conflict Iraq. At paragraph 630 of the Executive Summary, when Mr. Blair set out the UK's vision for the future of Iraq in the House of Commons on the 18th of March 2003, no assessment had been made of whether that vision was achievable, no agreement had been reached with the United States on a workable post-conflict plan, UN authorisation had not yet been secured, and there had been no decision on the UN role in post-conflict Iraq. Goes on at paragraph 814 to say, Mr. Blair, who recognised the significance of the post-conflict phase, did not press President Bush for definite assurances about US plans. He did not consider or seek advice on whether the absence of a satisfactory plan called for reassessment of the terms of the UK's engagement, and did not make agreement on such a plan a condition of UK participation in military action. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Chilcot report concludes that, I quote from paragraph 857, the UK did not achieve its objectives. The lack of planning has also been evident since in relation to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Syria, and most recently, with absolutely no plan whatsoever in regards to Brexit. So when will UK governments of either Tory or Labour hue actually start learning from the mistakes of the past so we are not condemned to repeat them? I hope and I expect that in the months ahead there will be the opportunity to hold to account those who are associated and responsible with taking the UK to war in Iraq that has only caused hundreds and thousands of deaths. Not just that, it has undermined people's faith in Parliament and government in the UK and left an indelible stain on Britain's standing in the world.
Let me thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks. He rightly says it is a sombre day, and he's absolutely correct to do that. He highlighted in his intervention a number of the very serious mistakes that were made, not least on planning for the aftermath. He asked me a specific question about why I didn't mention the specific Tony Blair note to President Bush. What I said, I was trying to be very careful in my statement to accurately summarise what Sir John Chilcot has said, and I did have a whole section in my statement saying about the processes, and I said Sir John finds that at crucial points Mr Blair sent personal notes and made important commitments to Mr Bush that had not been discussed or agreed with Cabinet colleagues. And I think it's worth reading Sir John Chilcot's statement this morning about that. He rightly focuses on paragraph 630, which is a powerful paragraph that says when Mr Blair set out the UK's vision of the future of Iraq, no assessment had been made about whether that vision was achievable, no agreement had been reached with the US on a workable post-conflict plan, UN authorisation had not been secured, etc. So, I mean, that is, I think, one of the most powerful passages in the report, and he's right to draw attention to it. I don't accept that all the same failures are apparent in some way when it comes to planning in Afghanistan. I don't accept that. Afghanistan, there was a very clear connection between a Taliban regime that was playing host to al-Qaeda and the goal of government policy, which I supported at the time and indeed put into place when I became Prime Minister, was to make sure that country couldn't become a safe haven for al-Qaeda. And there was some considerable success in pursuing that. And there was a huge amount of planning into the post-conflict situation in Afghanistan. Indeed, we're still engaged in that. To say there hasn't been a plan, there is a plan. There's a UK-run officer training academy to strengthen their army. But as I said in my earlier statement, you know, you can have all the plans in the world, but these are still extremely difficult things to get right. If he's somehow saying there's no point in ever taking part in any of these interventions or trying to help any of these countries, well, that's a different position, and you should be honest and say that. But I would argue with Afghanistan, with Libya, indeed with Brexit, we have set out what the alternatives are, but it doesn't mean they're easy.
Mr Crispin Blunt.
The Foreign Affairs Committee has stayed its inquiry into our intervention in Libya in order to take into account the conclusions of the Iraq inquiry. Given that the inquiry's central conclusions could be claimed to apply to some degree or other to Libya, not least stabilisation planning being described by my right honourable friend for Rutland at the time as fanciful rot, and to us in evidence as an unrealistic desktop exercise, would he reconsider his understandable decision not to give us oral evidence during the referendum campaign so that the reaching of the analysis of machinery of government changes he outlined earlier to the Right Honourable Member for Angus can be properly assessed by the committee?
I think the Foreign Secretary, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his remarks. I think the Foreign Secretary will be giving evidence. Obviously, the Prime Minister is always asked to give evidence to every Select Committee of the House. I try to stick to answering questions here and the Liaison Committee rather than, and also the National Security Committee, because that brings together a number of different committees. So I don't think it will be possible, but I always consider any request.
This is Margaret Beckett.
Can I first wholeheartedly endorse the remarks the Prime Minister made about those who lost their lives? Could I also ask him, does he agree that each of us, in Cabinet or in this House, who are responsible and should take responsibility for our own individual decisions, albeit taken in good faith on the basis of evidence before us? But equally, does he agree that the men of hatred and death in Al-Qaeda and Daesh ISIL should take responsibility for their actions and for the blood and horror that they inflict on others?
I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I mean, I speak as someone who is a relatively new backbencher, sitting up there, was listening to the arguments and coming to my own conclusions. And I think anyone who voted for the conflict has to take their share of responsibility. I don't choose to go back and say, well, if I knew now what I know then and all the rest of it. I just think you make a decision, you defend it at the time, and then you have to live with the consequences and bear your share of responsibility. And that's certainly the position I take. I think she does make a very good point, though, about the evil of these violent Islam extremists, whether in Al-Qaeda or Daesh or elsewhere. This problem in our world existed before the Iraq war. It exists and is worse today. We're doing all sorts of things in all sorts of ways to try and combat it. And while this debate about what happened in Iraq and the decisions that were taken is vital, we must not let it sap our energy for dealing with this cancer in our world, which is killing us in our own country.
Mr. David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, I think, referred to the cause or the aim of this war as weapons of mass destruction. But if I can draw his attention again back to the document from Tony Blair to the American President, it goes on later, after it says, "I'll be with you, whatever." Later on in that document, it says the reason for this is getting rid of Saddam Hussein is the right thing to do. Regime change, not WMD. And this fact, and the fact that, as Sir John Chilcot says, Blair's commitment made it very difficult for the UK to withdraw support for military action later on. This actually amounts to a deceit and a misleading of this House of Commons. It's not the only one, and Sir John has been very careful about avoiding accusing the previous Prime Minister of lying to the House, but a lot of the evidence here suggests he did. What action can this House take in dealing with that?
Well, I think my right honourable friend makes an important point. And it is, you know, I've had longer than anyone else to read this report, but it is still trying to get to the bottom of this particular issue. I accept is difficult. What Sir John Chilcot seems to be saying is the British government had a policy of sort of coercive diplomacy, wanting to use the pressure of the threat of military action in order to get Saddam to comprehensively disarm. But look, everyone's going to have to read the report and come to their own conclusions. But from my reading of it, Sir John Chilcot is not accusing anyone of deliberate, explicit deceit. But people have to read their own report and come to their own conclusions.
Tim Farron.
Today we stand alongside the families of 179 servicemen and women and 24 British civilians who died in the Iraq War. We also stand beside those many more who continue to live with injuries inflicted while serving their country in Iraq. We are proud of them and we honour them. Mr. Speaker, the Chilcot report makes clear the absolute determination of the former Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Blair, to pursue war in Iraq no matter the evidence. There is a stark contrast between that single-minded determination to go to war and the reckless and complete absence of any plan for what would come next. And what came next is 179 British servicemen and women killed. What came next is 100,000 or more Iraqi civilians killed. And what came next was the fueling of what is now ISIS-Daesh, which threatens not only Iraq, but the Middle East and indeed the safety of all of us. The much-missed Charles Kennedy said in this House in 2003, and I quote, "The big fear that many of us have is that this is simply going to breed further generations of suicide bombers." So will the Prime Minister now take the opportunity, on behalf of his party and this House, to acknowledge that Charles Kennedy was right all along in leading the opposition across this country against the counterproductive war? And should not those who accuse Charles Kennedy of appeasement, some of whom are still on these benches today, apologise to him, to his family, to our servicemen and women, to our country and to the people of Iraq?
Well, my recollection of the debates is there were honest disagreements between colleagues who were listening to the arguments and making their decisions. I don't think anyone should be accused of appeasement for voting against this war, nor should people who voted in favour of it in good faith on the evidence they would be given be subject to unfair criticism either. As I say, people who voted for the war, like me, have to take their share of responsibility. That's important, but I don't think it's right to accuse people who voted against of appeasement.
Mrs. Caroline Spelman.
I was Shadow International Development Secretary at the time and asked 91 written questions of the government, culminating in an Opposition Day debate on the 30th of January 2003, because I hadn't received answers, or any satisfactory answers. Would the Prime Minister, for the sake of the many, many victims, please assure the House that we have truly learnt the lesson of failure to plan for contingency?
I remember very well how effective my right honourable friend was in holding those debates, many debates. People say we didn't debate post-war reconstruction in Iraq. We did, actually, endlessly in this House. A lot of questions were put, a lot of debates were had. But it's quite clear from this report that there was a total planning failure, an assumption that the Americans had a plan when they didn't, an assumption that the UN would move in comprehensively when it didn't, an assumption, according to Sir John, that British troops would be out in 3 to 4 months, which obviously didn't happen. So I think it is one of the clearest areas of criticism. It's the area of failure, I think, that should be accepted most clearly, and it's the one that, for any future conflict, we have to plan for most carefully.
And Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for summing up the main findings of the Chilcot report, although, unlike him, I have not had the opportunity to even read the summary. But would he agree that in 2003, when I voted for the war, when he voted for the war, when many of our colleagues voted for the war, we did it on the basis of the knowledge that we had. Iraq was in breach of 17 UN resolutions in 2003. Saddam Hussein in 1988 already had killed 500,000 of his own people. He went on to kill more and more. The Shia in the south, the Kurds in the north, the Marsh Arabs in the south, and if you stood by the mass graves in Al-Hilla, where 10,000 Iraqi bodies lie, still many of them undiscovered. Those of us who'd campaigned for human rights over many years in Iraq, and I over 30 years, were very well aware of the torture and the horrors that were happening in that country. And I wish people would ask Iraqis what they think of the invasion. Because many Iraqis are grateful, Mr. Speaker, that we took the action that we did at that time. I hope we have greater opportunity to discuss these matters, because there was some planning, not enough, I agree, but there was some planning, part of which I was involved in, so I can speak about it. But the horrors of Saddam Hussein, what he did to his own people in Halabja and elsewhere, were clearly documented, and I think we were right to take part in that invasion.
Well, I well remember the speeches of the Right Honourable Lady when I was sitting over there and she was sitting over here. She made very powerful speeches about the appalling things Saddam Hussein did to his own people and the practices in that country. So I think that is a fair point. I also think when the case was made, of course, people were acting on the knowledge in front of them, and it wasn't just weapons of mass destruction, it was a sense that we were trying to uphold the position of the United Nations and the massive danger he posed to the region and to his own people. But we have to be frank, those of us who voted for this, that the consequences of what followed have been truly very poor. And that is what Sir John finds. And I think that section of his report, when he talks about the objectives of the government are not being met, and that far from dealing with a problem of potentially regimes linking up with terrorists, which Tony Blair talked about in this dispatch box, you know, this did end up with creating a space for Al-Qaeda. So we have to learn all of the lessons, including the ones that are more painful.
Mr. Peter Lilley.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that there are lessons for every member of this House and every member of the media as to how we assess evidence? We can no longer take refuge in the pretense